Before we begin tonight's story, if you're finding value in these accounts, please subscribe to the channel and leave a like. It helps us continue bringing these important stories to light. And I'd love to know where you're watching from. Drop your location in the comments below. Now, let's begin. I am James Winters, and I must tell you about the year I taught at a school that officially closed in 1987. I know exactly how that sounds, but every word I say from this point on is true. For over 20 years, I tried to forget it, trying hard to convince myself that it was an illusion, a breakdown, a fantasy rather than reality, but neither my nightmares ended nor could I escape the guilt. It was August of 2003 when I saw the job posting. I was fresh out of graduate school with a teaching degree, drowning in student loans, and living in my childhood bedroom in Albuquerque. The posting was on a university job board, hand-typed on yellowing paper, barely legible. It offered a position teaching multiple subjects at the St. Catherine's Indian School in northwestern New Mexico. Room and board included, salary significantly higher than average for the area, 1-year contract. I'd never heard of St. Catherine's, but that wasn't unusual. There were dozens of small schools scattered across the Navajo Nation and surrounding areas. What was unusual was that when I searched for information about it, I found almost nothing. No website, no recent mentions, just a few scattered references in old Bureau of Indian Affairs documents from the 1950s and 60s. I should have seen that as a warning. Instead, I saw it as an opportunity. I called the number on the posting. A woman answered, her voice formal and distant, like she was reading from a script. She asked a few perfunctory questions about my qualifications, then offered me the position on the spot. The school year would begin September 1st. I was to arrive 2 days prior for orientation. She gave me detailed directions, all involving unmarked dirt roads and specific geological landmarks. No GPS coordinates, no street address. Cell service is unreliable out here, she explained. You'll need to rely on the directions I'm giving you. Write them down carefully. I did. And 3 weeks later, I packed everything I owned into my 15-year-old Toyota and drove northwest into the high desert. The directions took me off the highway about 40 miles past Farmington, onto a dirt road that wound through increasingly desolate terrain. Red rock formations rose around me like ancient sentinels. The landscape was beautiful in a harsh, unforgiving way. I passed a few scattered homes, some traditional hogans, some modern prefabs, but as I drove deeper into the backcountry, even those disappeared. After 2 hours on the dirt road, following landmarks that seemed deliberately vague, I saw it. St. Catherine's Indian School stood alone on a flat stretch of desert, backed by a mesa that cast it in permanent shadow. It was a large, 2-story structure of red brick, institutional and imposing. The architecture was distinctly mid-century, all clean lines and functional design. A separate dormitory building stood to one side, and a small chapel to the other. Behind the main building, I could see what looked like a maintenance shed and a large field surrounded by a chain-link fence. There were no other vehicles in sight, no signs of life beyond the buildings themselves. I parked in front of the main entrance and got out. The silence was absolute. No wind, no birds, no distant traffic sounds, just the tick of my engine cooling and my footsteps on the gravel. The front door was unlocked. I pushed it open and stepped into a dim hallway that smelled of floor wax and old books. The walls were painted institutional green, the floor covered in worn linoleum. Classroom doors lined both sides of the hallway, each with a small window that showed rows of desks and blackboards. "Mr. Winters?" I turned. A woman had appeared at the end of the hallway, emerging from what looked like an office. She was perhaps 60, wearing a gray dress that looked like it came from another era. Her hair was pulled back in a severe bun, her expression neutral. Yes, I'm James Winters. I'm here for the teaching position. Of course. I'm Mrs. Crawford, the school administrator. Welcome to St. Catherine's. She didn't offer her hand. Let me show you to your quarters. You'll want to settle in before orientation tomorrow morning. She led me back outside and across the grounds to the dormitory building. Inside, the hallway was similar to the main building, all green paint and linoleum. She stopped at a door labeled Faculty 3 and produced a key. This will be your room. Meals are served in the main building cafeteria. Breakfast at 7, lunch at noon, dinner at 6. Attendance is mandatory for staff. She handed me the key. Orientation is tomorrow at 8 a.m. in the principal's office. Don't be late. She turned to leave, but I stopped her. Mrs. Crawford, how many students are enrolled this year? 23. And faculty? You'll meet everyone tomorrow. She walked away without another word. My room was spartanly furnished. A single bed, a desk, a chair, a small dresser. No television, no phone, not even a radio. The window looked out over the desert, endless red rock stretching to the horizon. I unpacked my few belongings and tried my cell phone. No signal, as promised. That night, lying in the narrow bed, I heard children singing. It was faint, coming from somewhere in the main building. A hymn, I thought, though I couldn't make out the words. It went on for about 20 minutes, then stopped abruptly, cut off mid-verse. I didn't sleep well. The next morning, I found the cafeteria and helped myself to breakfast from a serving line that seemed to have been set up hours earlier. Coffee, scrambled eggs, toast. Everything was lukewarm. I was the only person there. At 8 a.m. sharp, I presented myself at the principal's office. Mrs. Crawford was waiting, along with 3 other people. Mr. Winters, this is our principal, Mr. Hayes. She indicated a stern-looking man in his 50s, wearing a dark suit that looked like it had been pressed with military precision. Welcome, Mr. Winters. His handshake was firm, his eyes cold. We're pleased to have you join our staff. St. Catherine's has a long tradition of excellence in native education. This is Miss Peterson, who teaches the lower grades. A thin woman with graying hair nodded at me. And Mr. Coleman, who handles mathematics and sciences. A younger man, maybe 40, gave me a tight smile. And our nurse, Mrs. Douglas. An older woman in a white uniform nodded but didn't speak. There's also our groundskeeper, Samuel, Mrs. Crawford added, but he doesn't attend staff meetings. Mr. Hayes sat behind his desk and folded his hands. Let me explain our mission here, Mr. Winters. St. Catherine serves Native children who need structure, discipline, and a proper Christian education. Many of our students come from difficult situations. Our job is to provide them with the tools they need to succeed in modern American society. I noticed he didn't say which Native tribes the students came from or what difficult situations meant. You'll be teaching English, history, and general studies to the upper grades, 8 students ages 10 to 14. Miss Peterson handles the younger children. He slid a folder across the desk. Here are your materials, lesson plans, textbooks, student records. Review them tonight. Classes begin tomorrow morning at 8:30. I opened the folder. The textbooks listed were from the 1950s. The lesson plans focused heavily on American history and Christian education, with almost no mention of Native culture or languages. Mr. Hayes, these materials seem quite dated. Shouldn't we be using more current? Our curriculum has proven effective for over 50 years, Mr. Winters. We see no need to change what works. His tone made it clear the discussion was over. The orientation continued for another hour, covering rules, schedules, and expectations. Everything was rigid, regimented, focused on discipline and conformity. No mention of cultural sensitivity, of respecting the students' backgrounds, of anything beyond basic academic instruction and behavioral control. Finally, Mr. Hayes stood. "The students arrive this afternoon. You'll meet them at dinner. Remember, Mr. Winters, our role is to civilize, to Americanize, to prepare these children for success. Sentiment has no place in that mission. Civilize, Americanize." The words made my stomach turn, but I nodded. That afternoon, I heard the bus arrive. From my window, I watched children file off and line up in the courtyard. 23 of them, just as Mrs. Crawford had said. They stood in perfect rows, silent, as Mr. Hayes addressed them from the steps of the main building. I couldn't hear what he was saying, but I could see the children's faces. Blank. Resigned. Like they'd heard it all before. At dinner, I saw them up close for the first time. They sat at long tables in the cafeteria, boys on one side, girls on the other, eating in complete silence. The younger children looked to be about 6 or 7, the oldest maybe 14. They were all native, though I couldn't tell which specific tribes without asking. What struck me most was their clothing. The boys wore identical dark pants and white shirts. The girls wore plain dresses in navy blue, all the same style. Their hair was cut short, the boys in crew cuts, the girls just above the shoulders. They looked like they'd stepped out of a photograph from the 1950s. After dinner, I approached one of the older boys as he was clearing his tray. "Hi, I'm Mr. Winters. I'll be one of your teachers. What's your name?" He looked at me with dark, wary eyes. "Thomas, sir. Nice to meet you, Thomas. What grade are you in?" "7th, sir." "Where are you from? What's your tribe?" He glanced around nervously, then whispered, "We're not supposed to talk about that, sir." Before I could ask what he meant, Miss Peterson appeared at my elbow. "Mr. Winters, the students have study hall now. Best not to distract them." I watched Thomas hurry away, his shoulders hunched like he was expecting to be struck. That night, I reviewed the student files in my room. 23 students, ages 6 to 14. The files listed their English names but nothing else. No tribal affiliations, no family information, no background beyond the date they'd enrolled at St. Catherine's. What was strange was that all the enrollment dates were from the 1950s. The most recent was 1956, almost 50 years ago. I checked the dates again, thinking I'd misread them. But no, every single student file showed an enrollment date between 1951 and 1956, which was impossible. These children were clearly not in their 60s. I found Mrs. Crawford in her office. "There's a mistake in the student files. The enrollment dates are all from the 1950s. She looked up from her paperwork, her expression unchanging. "There's no mistake, Mr. Winters. But that's not possible. These children aren't. The files are correct. Is there anything else?" I stood there, feeling like I was in a conversation where I was missing some crucial context. No, I suppose not. Back in my room, I tried my cell phone again. Still no signal. I thought about driving back to Farmington, finding a phone, calling, who, and saying what? That the enrollment dates seemed wrong? That the textbooks were old? That the whole place felt off? I convinced myself I was overreacting. Rural schools often made do with outdated materials. Maybe the enrollment dates were just filing errors that no one had bothered to correct. But that night I heard the singing again. Children's voices rising in a hymn I didn't recognize, and this time I heard something else underneath it. Crying. Soft, desperate weeping, like someone trying very hard not to be heard. I got up and followed the sound. It led me to the main building, down the hallway to the classrooms. The crying was coming from one of the rooms at the far end. I opened the door, the room was dark, but I could see small shapes huddled in the corners. Children, they weren't supposed to be here. They were supposed to be in the dormitory, in bed. "Hey," I said softly, "are you okay? What are you doing here?" They didn't answer, didn't move. I flipped on the light. The room was empty. I stood there, the fluorescent lights humming, staring at the empty desks and chairs. But I'd seen them. I'd heard them. I was sure of it. I turned off the light and went back to my room. I didn't sleep at all that night. The next morning, classes began. I met my 8 students, all between 10 and 14 years old. They filed into my classroom in perfect silence, took their seats, and waited with hands folded on their desks. No fidgeting, no whispering, no typical childhood restlessness. "Good morning," I said, trying to sound cheerful. "I'm Mr. Winters. I'm looking forward to getting to know all of you this year." No response. 8 pairs of eyes stared at me, blank and waiting. I wrote my name on the blackboard and turned back to them. "Let's start by going around the room. Tell me your name and something about yourself." A girl in the front row raised her hand. She looked about 12, with long dark hair cut blunt at the shoulders. "Yes." "We already know our names, sir, and we're not supposed to talk about ourselves, only about our lessons." "Well, I don't know your names yet, so let's just Mary Toddachine, sir." She pointed to herself, then systematically pointed to each student. "Lucy Begay, Thomas Tsosi, Robert Nez, Ursula Yazzie, William Benally, Grace Chi, John Begay." She recited the names in a flat monotone, like reading from a list she'd memorized long ago. "Thank you, Mary. But I'd like to hear from each of you, in your own words. Maybe tell me about your families, or, 'We don't have families here, sir.'" This from Thomas, the boy I'd spoken to the night before. "Just the school. Everyone has a family, parents, siblings. We're not supposed to remember them, sir." This from Lucy, a small girl who looked about 10. "We're supposed to forget the old ways and become civilized." She said it like she was reciting from a textbook. And the look in her eyes was heartbreaking, like she was desperately trying to remember something she'd been forced to forget. I spent that first day teaching from the approved lesson plans, but my heart wasn't in it. I kept watching the children, noting the strange details, the way they never spoke unless spoken to, the way they moved in perfect synchronization during transitions, the way they seemed afraid of making any mistake, any deviation from expected behavior. At lunch, I pulled Miss Peterson aside. "The children seem very subdued. Is that normal?" She smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. "They've been well trained, Mr. Winters. That's the whole point of St. Catherine's, to train out the wildness, the savagery, to make them suitable for civilized society." The casual cruelty of her words made me physically recoil. "They're not wild or savage, they're children." Her smile faded. "You're new here. You'll understand soon enough. This is what's best for them, what they need." That evening, I found the groundskeeper, Samuel, working behind the maintenance shed. He was an older Navajo man, maybe 70, with weathered skin and kind eyes. He looked up as I approached, but didn't speak. "I'm James Winters, the new teacher." He nodded. "Can I ask you something? How long have you worked here?" He was quiet for so long I thought he wasn't going to answer. Then, "Since the beginning." "When was that?" 1951. "The year the school opened, according to the files." "That's a long time. Too long." He returned to his work, making it clear the conversation was over. I walked back toward the dormitory, my mind churning. Everything about this place felt wrong, but I couldn't articulate exactly why. Old materials, strict discipline, dated attitudes, those could all be explained by isolation and conservative administration. But the enrollment dates, the children's odd behavior, the crying in empty rooms, those didn't fit any rational explanation. I was almost to my room when I saw her. A little girl, maybe 7 years old, wearing a faded blue dress. She was standing at the end of the hallway, just staring at me. She looked familiar, like I'd seen her before. "Hello?" I said gently. "Are you lost? Do you need help finding your room?" She didn't answer, just stared with huge, solemn eyes. I took a step toward her. "It's okay. I'm a teacher here. My name is Mr. Winters." She opened her mouth and I expected her to speak. Instead, she made a sound, a soft keening that raised every hair on my body. Then she turned and ran, her footsteps echoing down the hall. I followed, but when I rounded the corner, she was gone. All the doors were closed. There was nowhere she could have disappeared to so quickly. Back in my room, I looked through the student files again, and I found her. Annie Tso, age 7, enrolled 1951. In the photo paper-clipped to her file, she was wearing the same faded blue dress. But the girl in the hallway had looked exactly like that photograph. Not aged, not grown. Exactly the same. I spent the next week teaching, observing, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. The children went through their days with mechanical precision. Wake at 6, breakfast at 7, classes from 8:30 to 3, dinner at 6, study hall until 8, bed at 9. Every day exactly the same. They never played, never laughed, never showed any sign of being normal children. And slowly I started noticing other things. The calendar in the principal's office said 1953. When I pointed this out, Mr. Hayes just smiled and said it was broken, but he never changed it. The newspapers in the staff lounge were from October 1953. The radio only picked up old programs, big band music and dramatic serials from the golden age of radio, and the students never aged. I know it had only been a week, but there was something in their faces, in their eyes. They looked like photographs, like they'd been frozen at a specific moment and never moved forward. On Friday evening, I was in my classroom after hours, trying to update the lesson plans to include something, anything about Native history or culture. I heard footsteps in the hallway and looked up to see Thomas standing in the doorway. "Mr. Winters, can I ask you something?" "Of course, come in." He glanced behind him nervously, then stepped inside and closed the door. "What year is it?" The question caught me off guard. "What do you mean?" "In the outside world, what year is it?" "It's 2003, September 2003. His face crumpled, and for the first time since I'd arrived, I saw real emotion from one of the students. Fear, desperation, grief. That's what I thought, but it can't be. Because I came here in 1953, I was 12 years old. My parents were told it was for 1 year, just 1 year to learn English and get an education. That was 50 years ago. His voice broke. "I'm still 12 years old, Mr. Winters. We're all still the same age we were when we came here. Why won't we age? Why won't they let us leave?" I stared at him, my rational mind screaming that this was impossible, that he was confused or lying or that I was having some kind of breakdown. But I looked into his eyes, and I knew he was telling the truth. "How many of you are there?" I whispered. 23. We were all taken from our families between 1951 and 1956. They told our parents it was mandatory, that we had to learn to be American. They cut our hair, took our clothes, forbade us to speak our languages. And then, he paused, tears streaming down his face. Then they never let us go home. And time just stopped. Before I could respond, the door burst open. Mr. Hayes stood there, his face rigid with fury. "Thomas, back to the dormitory. Now!" Thomas ran. Hayes turned to me. "Mr. Winters, a word in my office, immediately." I followed him down the hallway, my heart pounding. In his office, he closed the door and turned to face me. "You've been here 1 week, and already you're causing problems, asking questions, encouraging the students to remember things they need to forget." "Mr. Hayes, Thomas just told me." "Thomas is confused. They all are. It's part of their condition." "What condition? What is this place?" He studied me for a long moment. Then he walked to his window and looked out over the dark desert. St. Catherine's Indian School was established in 1951 to civilize native children, to remove the Indian and save the child. We did our job well, too well, perhaps. He turned back to me. "The children you're teaching, Mr. Winters, they are the successes. The ones who survived the process. 23 students who fully embraced civilization, who completely shed their savage ways. They're children, not savages. They were savages, we fixed them. The problem is, we fixed them so completely that they became frozen, perfect examples of what we were trying to create. And somehow, the school became frozen with them." His voice was matter-of-fact, like he was describing a curriculum change. "Welcome to St. Catherine's, Mr. Winters. You're part of it now, just like the rest of us." "What are you talking about?" He smiled, and it was the coldest thing I'd ever seen. "You can't leave. None of us can. We're all trapped here in 1953 forever. Teachers come, teachers stay. The students never leave, never age, never change. And neither will you." I ran. I didn't think. I just ran. Out of his office, down the hallway, out the front door. I ran to my car, fumbled with the keys, started the engine. The car worked. The engine turned over. But when I tried to drive away, the road disappeared. Where there should have been the dirt track leading back to civilization, there was nothing but empty desert. I tried going in different directions, but it was the same. The desert extended forever in every direction except back toward the school. I sat there in my car, engine running, staring out at the impossible emptiness. Finally, I turned around and drove back to St. Catherine's. Mr. Hayes was waiting on the steps, that cold smile still on his face. "Welcome to your first day, Mr. Winters," he said. "You'll have many more." The first month was denial. I kept trying to leave, kept testing the boundaries of whatever had trapped us here. Every direction led back to the school. Time didn't progress. My watch still said 2003, showed the passing days and weeks, but outside the calendar never changed from October 15th, 1953. The sun rose and set, but nothing else moved forward. I wasn't alone in my captivity. The other teachers were trapped too, though they'd long since accepted their fate. Miss Peterson had arrived in 1967, Mr. Coleman in 1982. Mrs. Douglas didn't even remember when she'd come anymore. They'd all been absorbed into the eternal present of St. Catherine's, going through the motions of education in a school that had become its own isolated pocket of time. But I couldn't accept it. Not yet. So I focused on what I could control. My students. There were 8 children in my classroom, frozen between the ages of 10 and 14. Thomas Tasosi, the boy who'd first told me the truth. Mary Totachin, who'd been the first to arrive in 1951 and who now served as an unofficial leader among the students. Lucy Begay, Ursula Yazzie, Grace Chi, Robert Nez, William Benally, and John Begay. 8 children who should have been in their 60s, who should have lived full lives, had families, grown old. Instead, they were still children, still sitting in neat rows, still reciting lessons they'd memorized 50 years ago. I started small. Instead of following the approved curriculum, I began asking them about themselves. Where they'd come from, what they remembered from before St. Catherine's. At first, they were reluctant, scared. The rules against speaking about their past were deeply ingrained. But slowly, in whispers during lunch or in quiet moments after class, they started to remember. Thomas had come from a community near Shiprock. His parents had owned sheep, and he'd spent his childhood learning to tend them, learning the songs and stories that went with that way of life. He could still remember some of the Navajo his grandmother had taught him, though speaking it out loud terrified him. Mary had been taken from Canyon to Shelley. She'd had 6 siblings, a huge extended family, a whole world that had been stripped away when the Bureau of Indian Affairs agents came to her parents' Hogan and said education was mandatory. She barely remembered her Navajo name anymore. Lucy had forgotten almost everything. She'd been only 6 when she arrived, and 50 years of St. Catharines had erased most of her memories. Sometimes she'd cry without knowing why, grieving for a family she could no longer picture. It was in the 3rd week that I discovered the punishment room. I'd heard references to it in whispers among the students. Don't let them send you to the basement. Remember what happened to Annie last time? But when I asked what they meant, they'd go silent, faces pale with fear. One morning, I witnessed it firsthand. We were in the middle of English lessons when Thomas made a mistake. He'd been reading aloud from a textbook and accidentally used a Navajo word, letting it slip out in the middle of an English sentence. It was barely noticeable, just one word, but Mr. Hayes happened to be walking past our classroom at that exact moment. He stopped. The hallway went silent. Even through the closed door, I could feel the temperature drop. Hayes entered the classroom, his face a mask of controlled fury. "What did you say?" Thomas's face had gone white. "I'm sorry, sir. I didn't mean—" "Stand up." Thomas stood on shaking legs. "You know the rules. English only. No savage languages in this school." "It was an accident, Mr. Hayes," I interjected. "He didn't mean to—" Hayes turned to me with such cold rage that I took a step back. "Mr. Winters, you may be new here, but you will learn our methods. This is not negotiable." He grabbed Thomas by the arm. "Come with me." "Where are you taking him?" "To be corrected." I followed them out into the hallway, the other students watching with terrified eyes. Hayes dragged Thomas toward a door at the end of the building, one I'd never seen opened before. It was labeled Maintenance, Staff Only. "Mr. Hayes, this is excessive. He made a simple mistake. There are no simple mistakes when it comes to civilization, Mr. Winters. These children must learn. If kindness would teach them, we'd use kindness. But sometimes, discipline is the only language they understand." He pulled out a key and unlocked the door. Behind it was a staircase leading down into darkness. "Please," Thomas whispered. "Please don't." Hayes shoved him through the door. 3 hours should be sufficient. The door closed. I heard a lock click. I stood there, stunned. You can't just lock a child in a basement. That's abuse. That's discipline. Hayes turned to face me. "Mr. Winters, I realize you come from a more permissive era. But here at St. Catharines, we maintain standards. The children need to understand that there are consequences for regression, for reverting to their savage natures. He's a child, not a savage. He will be civilized, or he will be punished until he is." Hayes walked away, leaving me standing in front of that locked door. I waited until he was out of sight, then tried the handle. Locked. I put my ear to the door and heard nothing. No crying, no pleading, just silence. After 20 minutes, I couldn't take it anymore. I went to find Samuel, the groundskeeper. If anyone had a key to that door, it would be him. I found him behind the main building, working in the small cemetery. Yes, cemetery. I'd discovered it my 2nd week. Rows of small white crosses, maybe 30 of them, stretching out behind the school. When I'd asked Samuel about them, he'd said simply, "The ones who didn't make it." "Samuel, I need your help. Mr. Hayes locked Thomas in the basement. I need a key to get him out. Samuel didn't look up from his digging. Can't help you. He's been down there almost half an hour. He's just a child. They're all children. Been children for 50 years. Samuel finally met my eyes. And I've been burying children for just as long. Don't ask me to help, I can't. What do you mean, burying children? Those graves? Are those... Not all the students made it through the process, Mr. Winters. Some couldn't handle the correction. Their bodies are in the ground. Their spirits are still here. He went back to digging. Thomas will survive. He always does. Let it be. I left him and went back to the basement door. I sat down with my back against it and waited. After an hour, I heard sounds from below. Not Thomas's voice, but something else. Crying. Multiple voices. Children crying. But Thomas was alone down there, wasn't he? At the 3-hour mark, Mr. Hayes returned with the key. He unlocked the door and descended the stairs. A few minutes later, he emerged with Thomas. The boy was pale, shaking, but physically unharmed. Back to class, Thomas, and remember what you learned today. Thomas wouldn't look at me as he passed. He walked back to the classroom with mechanical precision, and when he took his seat, his face was blank. Whatever had happened in that basement, it had worked. For the rest of the day, he was the perfect student. Quiet, obedient, empty. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about those other voices I'd heard, about what Samuel had said about spirits still being here, about the 30 graves behind the school. Around midnight, I gave up on sleep and went for a walk. The school was quiet. The students locked in their dormitory for the night. I found myself standing in front of that basement door, keys in hand. I'd borrowed them from Mrs. Crawford's office earlier that day. I shouldn't have gone down there. Looking back, I understand that I was violating something. Crossing a threshold I should have respected, but I needed to know what was happening to these children in that basement. I unlocked the door and descended the stairs. The basement was larger than I expected, stretching the full length of the building. It was divided into several rooms, and as I explored, I realized it was set up like a twisted mirror of the school above. Classrooms with small desks, a cafeteria with long tables, even a small chapel. But everything was wrong. The desks were stained with what looked like blood. The walls were covered in scratch marks, desperate gouges made by small fingers, and written on every surface, in dozens of different hands, were the same words repeated over and over. I will be good, I will speak English, I will forget the old ways. In one room, I found what looked like restraints built into the walls. Leather straps sized for children. In another, I found a cabinet full of soap, the kind used for washing mouths out. In a third, scissors and razors, the blades still crusted with old hair. This was where they'd corrected the children. This was where they'd beaten and starved and terrorized kids into forgetting their languages, their families, their entire cultures. And then I saw them. Children. Dozens of them. Standing in the corners, sitting at the desks, huddled in groups against the walls. They were translucent, flickering like old film, but they were there. They were all native children, wearing the same institutional clothing as the students upstairs, but these children bore visible marks of abuse. Bruises. Cuts. Some were holding their mouths like they'd been forced to swallow soap. Others were clutching at shorn hair, crying silently. You shouldn't be here. I spun around. Samuel stood at the bottom of the stairs holding a lantern. What is this? I asked, my voice shaking. Who are these children? The ones who fought back. The ones who refused to forget. The ones who died still remembering their names. He walked into the room, and the ghost children moved aside for him. This basement is where it happened, where they broke the strong ones and lost them. These spirits have been here since the beginning, reliving their punishments over and over. How many? 217. That's how many children died at St. Catherine's between 1951 and 1987. Some from disease, some from accidents, many from the punishments. They're all down here. I stared at the ghost children, and understanding crashed over me. When Thomas was sent down here, they were here too. That's what I heard, all of them crying. The living students can see them, can hear them. That's part of the punishment, sending them down here to face what could happen to them if they don't obey. Samuel's voice was hollow. I warned you not to help. This place, it's not just frozen in time. It's frozen in its worst moment, the moment when it was doing the most damage. We have to do something. We have to help them. There's nothing to do. The school won't release them. As long as St. Catherine's exists in this state, the children upstairs stay frozen, and the children down here stay dead. It's all connected. I spent the rest of that night in the basement, witnessing what these ghost children endured, watching them relive their punishments, their deaths, their endless suffering. And I understood then what St. Catherine's really was. Not just a boarding school, not just a place of forced assimilation. It was a wound in time, a scar that had never healed, kept open and bleeding by the trauma of what had happened here. By dawn, I'd made a decision. I couldn't leave. I couldn't save myself. But maybe, somehow, I could save them. The next day, I started documenting everything. I wrote down the names of every ghost child I'd seen, cross-referencing them with the student records I could find in the office. I recorded the punishments, the methods used, the philosophies that had justified such cruelty. And I started teaching differently. Instead of the approved curriculum, I began telling my students about their history, about the strength of native cultures, about the wrong that had been done to them, about resistance and survival. I taught them that forgetting wasn't a virtue, that their languages and traditions were valuable, that they had nothing to be ashamed of. It didn't take long for Hayes to notice. One morning, he burst into my classroom in the middle of a lesson about the Long Walk, when the Navajo had been forcibly marched to Bosque Redondo. "What are you teaching them?" he demanded. "History, their history. This is not approved curriculum. The approved curriculum is propaganda designed to destroy their identity. I won't teach it anymore." His face turned red. "You will teach what you're told, or you'll join Thomas in the basement." "Then I'll join him, because I'm not going to participate in cultural genocide anymore." He grabbed me by the arm, and I didn't resist. If I was going to the basement, I wanted to see it with the students, to witness what they faced. As Hayes dragged me toward the door, all 8 of my students stood up. "We'll go too." This from Mary, her voice clear and strong. "If you punish Mr. Winters for teaching us the truth, you'll have to punish all of us." Hayes froze. In 50 years of running this school, I don't think he'd ever faced open rebellion from the students. They'd always been compliant, broken, obedient. "Sit down," he ordered. "No." Thomas stepped forward. "We're tired of forgetting. We're tired of being punished for remembering who we are. If this school is going to keep us here forever, then we're going to remember. We're going to speak our languages. We're going to use our real names. You will be disciplined. We've been disciplined for 50 years. Mary's voice rang out. "And we're still here, still children, still trapped. Your punishments don't work anymore, Mr. Hayes. They never worked. They just made us forget who we were." Hayes looked around at the 8 defiant faces, and for the first time I saw uncertainty in his eyes. "This is mutiny. This is freedom," I said quietly. "Even if we can't leave, even if we're stuck here, we can still choose. We can choose to remember. We can choose to resist. Hayes released my arm and stepped back. You're making a terrible mistake. The school won't allow this. It will correct you, all of you. Let it try, Thomas said. That night, the basement door opened on its own. A silent invitation. But when I went down there, the ghost children were different. They weren't reliving their punishments anymore. They were standing still, watching me. One little girl approached. She was maybe 7 years old, wearing a faded dress. I recognized her from the student records. Annie So, died 1953. Thank you, she whispered, for remembering us, for saying our names. I'm sorry, I said. I'm sorry this happened to you, all of you. It's not over yet, she said. The school is angry. It's going to try to break you like it broke us, but maybe this time will be different. She faded back into the shadows, and I climbed the stairs back to the world above, carrying the weight of 217 ghosts, and the knowledge that the battle for these children's souls was far from over. The punishment room had shown me the truth. Now I had to figure out what to do with it. The rebellion changed everything. In the weeks that followed, my 8 students began the slow, painful process of remembering. Thomas taught the others Navajo words he'd kept hidden in the back of his mind for 50 years. Mary started using her traditional name, Asta Nees. Lucy cried for days as fragments of memory returned, her mother's face, Usis, slowly coming back into focus. The other teachers watched with a mixture of horror and fascination. Miss Peterson tried to intervene once, insisting I was undoing years of progress. But when I asked her what progress meant when measured against 50 years of imprisonment, she had no answer. Mr. Hayes stopped attending classes. I'd see him in his office staring at the wall calendar that still said October 1953, as if waiting for something to change. The school had been his life's work, his mission to civilize and Americanize. Now his perfect students were choosing to become uncivilized again, and he didn't know how to stop them. But I was starting to understand something darker. The school didn't want to stop them. It wanted something else. I realized this when I noticed the students were aging. It was subtle at first, Mary's hair growing slightly longer than the regulation cut. Thomas's voice dropping half an octave. Lucy gaining an inch in height. After 50 years of being frozen at the exact same age, they were finally changing. At first, I thought it was a good sign. A sign that breaking free of the school's rules was breaking the temporal prison that held us. But Samuel corrected me. It's not freedom, he said. We were standing in the cemetery behind the school, where he spent most of his time now. It's the school preparing. Preparing for what? For harvest. He pointed to the 30 white crosses. These aren't all the dead children, Mr. Winters. These are just the ones buried on the surface. The ones whose parents were notified, whose deaths could be explained away as disease or accident. What about the 217 in the basement? Come with me. He led me past the cemetery, through a gate I'd never noticed before, to a large field behind the school. It was overgrown with wild grass and sage, unmarked and seemingly empty. But as we walked through it, I began to see disturbed earth, subtle depressions in the ground, dozens of them scattered across the field. This is where they buried the others, the ones who died from the punishments, the ones who fought back and lost, the ones whose families were told they ran away. Samuel knelt and touched the ground. 217 children laid in unmarked graves, forgotten by everyone except the earth. I felt sick. Why are you showing me this? Because the students are starting to remember, and when you remember, you start to exist again. You start to age, you start to die. He looked up at me with haunted eyes. The school is built on these graves, Mr. Winters. It draws power from them, from the grief, the trauma, the stolen lives, and when students start to break free, when they start to remember who they are, the school feeds on that too. What are you saying? I'm saying your students are in danger, more danger than they've ever been, because now they're not just frozen children, they're children who are starting to live again. And the school is hungry. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about that field, about 217 small bodies buried without ceremony, without even the dignity of their names on a marker. I thought about my 8 students, finally remembering who they were, not realizing they might be feeding themselves to the very thing that had imprisoned them. I was staring out my window, watching the stars, when I heard the singing. It was coming from the field, the unmarked field, children's voices rising in a language I didn't understand but somehow felt in my bones. A morning song, a prayer for the dead. I ran outside and toward the field. The moon was bright enough to see by, and what I saw froze me in my tracks. The ground was moving. Not violently, but slowly, deliberately, as if something beneath was trying to push upward. And standing among the disturbed earth were ghosts, dozens of them. The children from the basement, the 217 who'd never been properly mourned, never been given the rights their cultures demanded. They were digging, small ghost hands clawing at the earth, trying to unbury themselves. They do this every night. I spun around. Samuel stood behind me, holding his ever-present shovel. They try to dig themselves out, to go home. But they can't. The school holds them here. He walked past me into the field. I've been the groundskeeper for 70 years, Mr. Winters. Every morning, I come out here and smooth over the earth they've disturbed, covering them up again, making it look like nothing happened. That's my job. That's my punishment. Punishment for what? For surviving. His voice cracked. I worked here when it was operational. 1951 to 1987, I watched it all happen. The children being taken from their families. The beatings, the forced forgetting, the deaths. And I didn't stop it. I told myself I was just the groundskeeper. Not my place to interfere, not my responsibility. He looked at the ghost children. So now I'm trapped here too. Forced to watch them try to escape every night. Forced to bury them again every morning. Samuel, you were a victim too. I was a coward. He started smoothing the earth with his shovel. And these children pay the price for my cowardice every single night. I stood there watching the ghost children dig, knowing they'd never make it out, knowing this was their eternal fate. And I understood that St. Catherine's wasn't just frozen in time. It was frozen in its worst moment, forcing everyone to relive the trauma over and over. The living students trapped in childhood. The dead students trapped in death. The staff trapped in their complicity. All of us, frozen in 1953 when the school was at its most brutal, its most efficient at destroying culture and identity. There has to be a way to free them, I said. There is. Samuel stopped working and leaned on his shovel. Acknowledge them, speak their names, give them the burial rights they were denied. Let them be mourned as native children, not as failed experiments in civilization. But I don't know the proper ceremonies. I don't know the prayers. Your students do, or they're starting to remember them. He gestured back toward the school. That's why the school is getting angry. That's why it's preparing to harvest. Because if your students remember enough, if they perform the right ceremonies, they can free these children. And if these children are freed, the school loses its power. Its hold on all of us might break. The next day, I gathered my 8 students and told them about the field. about the 217 children buried there without names, without ceremony, without acknowledgement. I watched their faces as understanding dawned. "We have to help them," Mary said immediately. "We have to give them what they were denied. Do you remember the ceremonies, the prayers for the dead?" Thomas nodded slowly. "I remember some. My grandmother taught me. I thought I'd forgotten, but it's coming back." Over the next week, my students worked in secret, pooling their fragmented memories of traditional burial practices, mourning songs, and prayers for the dead. They couldn't remember everything perfectly, but they remembered enough. And what they couldn't remember, they reconstructed from the pieces they had. I knew it was dangerous. I could feel the school watching us, feel its anger building like a storm. The temperature dropped, lights flickered. The basement door would open and close at random, as if inviting us down, tempting us to give up. But the students were determined. For the first time in 50 years, they had a purpose beyond survival. They could help the others, the ones who hadn't made it, the ones who died still fighting to remember. On the night we chose, we gathered in the unmarked field. All 8 students, myself and Samuel. The ghost children appeared as soon as we arrived, watching silently. Mary stood in the center and began to speak. Her Navajo was halting, broken by decades of forced forgetting, but the words came. She spoke the names of the dead as Samuel read them from a list he'd kept for 70 years. 217 names. 217 children who deserved to be remembered. As each name was spoken, something shifted. The ghost child associated with that name would grow brighter, more solid, more real. Not alive, but acknowledged, seen, honored. Thomas began to sing. It was a morning song, one his grandmother had taught him before he was taken. The other students joined in, their voices rough from disuse but growing stronger with each verse. And the earth began to change. Where there had been shallow, unmarked graves, small mounds appeared. Not disturbed earth, but proper burial mounds, the kind that would be created with ceremony and care. The ghost children stopped digging. One by one they lay down on their mounds, finally at rest. I felt tears streaming down my face as I watched. These children, denied everything in life, were finally being given dignity in death. But the school was fighting back. The ground began to shake. The walls of St. Catherine's groaned and cracked. Windows shattered, and I heard Mr. Hayes screaming from inside, though I couldn't make out the words. "Keep singing," Samuel shouted. "Don't stop." The students sang louder, pushing through their fear. And as the last name was spoken, as the last child was acknowledged and honored, something broke. The pressure that had held the school in eternal 1953 released with an audible crack. I felt time rush back in, 50 years hitting all at once. The stars overhead shifted to their proper positions. The air changed, warming from October 1953 to whatever year we were actually in. And my 8 students began to age. It happened rapidly, horrifyingly. 50 years of life they should have lived playing out in seconds. Thomas went from 12 to 62. Mary's hair turned gray, then white. Lucy collapsed as her child's body tried to become an adult's all at once. "No!" I ran to them, trying to help, trying to stop it. "This isn't what was supposed to happen." Samuel grabbed my arm. "This is freedom, Mr. Winters. They're finally living the lives that were stolen from them, all of it, all at once." I watched in horror as my students aged and died in front of me, their bodies crumbling to dust, returning to the earth they'd been separated from for so long. Within minutes, all 8 were gone, leaving only piles of clothing and empty space where they'd stood. But the ghost children in the field were smiling. and as I watched, the 8 students appeared among them, no longer living, but no longer trapped either. They'd chosen death over eternal imprisonment. They'd chosen to age, to live, to die, rather than remain frozen forever. The school groaned once more and began to collapse. The eternal 1953 that had held it together was gone. Without the temporal loop, without the power drawn from unacknowledged dead, St. Catherine's was finally dying. "We need to leave," Samuel said. "Now." We ran as the buildings fell, as 70 years of stasis crumbled into dust. When we reached the edge of the property, I turned to look back. St. Catherine's Indian School was gone. In its place was rubble, ruins, the bones of a building that had died long ago. And standing among the ruins were 225 ghost children, all of them smiling, all of them finally free. Samuel and I stood there for a long time, watching them fade into the dawn light. "What happens now?" I asked. "Now?" Samuel looked at his hands, wrinkled and spotted with age. "Now we're old men who survived something that shouldn't exist. Now we have to decide what to do with that survival. We have to tell people about what happened here, about the children. Who's going to believe us? A teacher and a groundskeeper claiming they were trapped in 1953 for years, claiming there are mass graves of Native children. Then we'll find proof. We'll bring people here, show them the graves, make them acknowledge what happened." Samuel was quiet for a long time. Then he nodded. "All right. We'll try. For them." He gestured to where the ghost children had been. "We'll make sure they're remembered." As the sun rose fully, I felt time settle around me properly for the first time in months. My watch, my phone, my body, all finally synchronized with the real world. It was 2004. I'd been gone for over a year, but more importantly, I had work to do. 217 children were buried in that field, and the world needed to know their names. The drive back to civilization took 3 hours. Samuel and I didn't speak much. What was there to say? We'd escaped a temporal prison, watched children age 50 years in seconds, witnessed the collapse of a building that had been frozen in its worst moment for half a century. Words felt inadequate. When we finally hit paved road, I pulled over and checked my phone. It powered on, found signal, and immediately began buzzing with missed calls and messages. My family, friends, the university where I'd been studying, all wondering where I'd been for over a year. I had no idea how to explain. Samuel looked at the phone like it was alien technology. "What year did you say it was?" 2004. September 2004. I went to work at St. Catherine's in 1951. Thought I'd work there a few years, save some money, move on. He laughed, but there was no humor in it. Looks like I saved a lot of time at least. We drove to Farmington and checked into a motel. The clerk looked at us strangely. 2 men who appeared to be in their 30s and 60s respectively, wearing outdated clothing and looking shell-shocked. But she took our cash and gave us a room. That night, I tried to organize my thoughts. I had documentation, the lists Samuel had kept of names and dates. I had my own testimony. But I needed proof that would make people believe. Proof that would lead to the discovery of those graves. The next morning, I called the Bureau of Indian Affairs, then the New Mexico State Police, then the FBI. I told each of them the same story. There was an abandoned boarding school in northwestern New Mexico with unmarked graves. 217 children, buried without ceremony, without acknowledgement. The responses varied from skeptical to dismissive. Without exact coordinates, without physical evidence, they weren't going to investigate. Unmarked graves at old boarding schools were, unfortunately, not uncommon, And they certainly weren't going to mount an expensive search operation based on the word of a missing teacher who'd just reappeared after a year. "We have to take them there," Samuel said. "Show them the field." But when we drove back to where St. Catherine's had been, we found nothing. The dirt road was there, the landmarks we'd followed, but the school grounds were gone. Not destroyed, not collapsed. Simply absent, like they'd never existed. The mesa was there, the flat desert, the red rock formations, but no ruins, no rubble, no evidence that a building had ever stood on that spot. Samuel walked the area for hours, trying to find the field, the graves, anything, but the landscape had healed over, leaving no trace of the trauma that had occurred there. "It's like it was erased," I said. "Or like it existed outside normal space," Samuel replied. "Frozen in 1953 so completely that when the loop broke, it collapsed back into nothing, into the temporal void it had been occupying." We drove back to Farmington in defeat. Without the graves, without physical proof, we had nothing but an incredible story that no one would believe. I spent the next few weeks trying to rebuild my life. I contacted my family, explained I'd been working at a remote school with no phone service, apologized for not keeping in touch. They were hurt, confused, but eventually forgave me. I tried to return to my teaching program, but found I'd been dropped for non-attendance. I applied for other positions, but explaining the year-long gap in my resume proved impossible. Slowly, I began to accept that I was going to have to move on. Put St. Catherine's behind me. Try to forget. But I couldn't forget the children, the 25 whose names I knew, the 217 in the field. They haunted my dreams, asking why I'd stopped fighting for them, why I'd given up on telling their story. It was Samuel who found the solution. 3 months after our escape, he called me. He'd been doing research, combing through old BIA records, newspaper archives, anything he could find about native boarding schools in New Mexico, and he'd found something. There were 7 schools, he told me over the phone. 7 boarding schools in northwestern New Mexico between 1870 and 1990. 6 are well documented, with records, photographs, alumni associations, but the 7th, St. Catherine's, it appears in documents from 1951 to 1953, then vanishes. No closure date, no transfer records for students, nothing. It's like it blinked out of existence in late 1953. "Because that's when it got stuck," I said. "When whatever happened there created the temporal loop." "Right. But here's the thing. If we can prove the school existed, even if we can't find the physical location, we can make a case for investigation. We can argue that the missing students, the ones whose families never got closure, deserve to have their fates determined." Over the next year, we built our case. Samuel and I tracked down families who'd had children enrolled at St. Catherine's in the early 1950s. Most of the parents were dead, but we found siblings, children, grandchildren, people who'd grown up with stories about a brother or sister who went to boarding school and never came home. 23 families, matching the 23 students who'd been trapped with me. We compiled testimony, collected what few photographs existed, built a timeline, and we presented it all to the National Native American Boarding School Healing Coalition, an organization dedicated to investigating the history and impact of the boarding school system. They listened, and more importantly, they believed us. Not the part about temporal loops and ghost children, of course, but the part about missing students, unaccounted deaths, and potential unmarked graves. That they understood all too well. Similar stories were emerging from boarding schools across the country and Canada. In 2006, the coalition began a formal investigation into St. Catherine's Indian School. They used ground-penetrating radar, thermal imaging, and old survey maps to search the area where we believed the school had been. and they found something. Soil disturbances consistent with burial sites. Not at the exact location I remembered, but close enough. The field had been there. The graves were real, even if the school had somehow vanished from physical existence. The excavation began in 2007. I was there the day they uncovered the first remains. A small skeleton, probably 7 or 8 years old, buried in a simple wooden box that had long since rotted away. The forensic team took samples, ran tests, tried to identify which child it was. Over the next 2 years, they exhumed 217 sets of remains. Children ranging in age from 5 to 16, buried without markers, without ceremony, without even basic coffins in many cases. DNA testing and dental records eventually identified 189 of them. The other 28 remained unknown, but Samuel and I knew them. We had their names on his list, and when the coalition asked for help identifying the unknown children, we provided what we could. Not all the identifications could be confirmed scientifically, but the families who claimed those remains knew. They'd been waiting 60 years for their children to come home. The discovery made national news. St. Catherine's became a symbol of the broader horrors of the boarding school system. One more piece of evidence in a dark chapter of American history that was finally being acknowledged. I was interviewed dozens of times. I stuck to the facts I could prove. I'd taken a job at a remote school, found evidence of abuse, helped uncover mass graves. I didn't mention the temporal loop, the frozen students, the ghost children digging themselves out every night. Some truths are too strange to share. But I did make sure every child's name was spoken publicly. Every single one of the 217 was acknowledged, honored, and mourned in the way they should have been when they died. In 2010, a memorial was erected at the site. 217 small stone markers, each engraved with a name, and 25 larger stones for the students who'd survived the school's physical operation but had been trapped in its temporal prison. Mary Totachin, Thomas Sosi, Lucy Begay, and the others. Their names were added to the memorial as well, acknowledged as victims of a system that had tried to erase them. The memorial dedication was attended by hundreds of people, family members who'd never known what happened to their relatives, Native activists and educators who'd fought for years to expose the truth about boarding schools, government officials who offered apologies that felt both necessary and inadequate. Samuel and I stood at the back of the crowd, 2 old men who'd seen things no one else would believe. As the names were read aloud, I felt not closure exactly. How could there be closure for such horror? But perhaps acknowledgement, witnessing, the knowledge that these children were no longer forgotten. After the ceremony, a young Navajo woman approached me. She was maybe 25, with intelligent eyes and a familiar face. "Mr. Winters, I'm Naomi Totachin. Mary was my great-grandmother's sister. Our family has been looking for her for 60 years. I'm so sorry for what happened to her. My grandmother said Mary was brilliant, spoke 3 languages by the time she was 10. Could have done anything." Naomi's voice was quiet. Instead, she spent 50 years trapped in a building that wanted to destroy everything she was. That's not right. That's not justice. No, I agreed, it's not. But at least now people know. Her story is part of the record. Is it true what they say? That you were there? That you saw what happened? I hesitated, then nodded. I was there, I saw. Then thank you. For witnessing. For making sure she wasn't forgotten. Naomi squeezed my hand and walked away. Samuel died in 2012. The strain of carrying what we'd experienced, of being one of the last living witnesses to St. Catherine's horrors, had taken its toll. In his final days, he told me he was ready to rest. ready to stop carrying the weight of those graves. I visit the memorial twice a year, spring and fall, when the desert air is mild and the light hits the stone markers just right. I walk among the names, speaking each one aloud, making sure they're remembered. Sometimes I see things, flickers at the edge of vision, children playing among the stones, laughing in languages that were supposed to have been beaten out of them. I don't know if they're really there, or if I'm just an old man who saw too much strange in his youth. It doesn't matter either way. Last month, I received a letter from the National Native American Boarding School Healing Coalition. They're compiling a comprehensive database of every child who died or disappeared in the boarding school system. Over 40,000 children so far, and they're still counting. They asked if I'd contribute my testimony about St. Catherine's to be preserved in the official record. I said yes. I'm 71 years old now. I've spent the last 20 years teaching at a tribal college, trying to undo in some small way the damage that schools like St. Catherine's inflicted. I teach Native history, literature, culture. I teach my students to be proud of their languages, their traditions, their identities. Everything St. Catherine's tried to destroy. And I tell them stories, not the whole truth, not the impossible parts, but the important truth that there were schools designed to kill the Indian and save the child, that thousands of children died or disappeared in these schools, that the effects of that trauma still echo through Native communities today. And that remembering is an act of resistance. Acknowledging is an act of healing. Speaking the names of the dead is how we ensure they're never truly erased. The bell at St. Catherine's rang for the last time in 1953 when the school became unstuck from time and trapped in its worst moment. But in a way, it's still ringing. Every time someone speaks the name of a child who died there. Every time a family learns what happened to their missing relative. Every time the truth about these schools is told. The bell rings on, not to call children to lessons designed to destroy them, but to call the world to witness, to remember, to acknowledge the genocide that was dressed up as education. I'm old now. Soon I'll join Samuel and Mary and Thomas and the rest. But before I go, I wanted to write this down. The full story, the impossible parts included. Because someone needs to know what I saw. Someone needs to understand that St. Catherine's Indian School didn't just destroy children's cultures and identities. It destroyed their connection to time itself, trapped them in an eternal moment of trauma, and fed on their suffering for 50 years. And someone needs to know that in the end, the children won. They remembered. They resisted. They freed each other from the prison of 1953, even though it cost them their lives to do it. They chose death over forgetting. They chose to age, to die, to turn to dust, rather than remain frozen in the school's attempt to civilize them. And in that choice, they were finally, truly free. The boarding school is closed now. Has been since 1953, though it took until 2004 for the building to actually collapse. The children are remembered, their names spoken, their graves marked. But there are still dozens of schools out there, hundreds of unmarked graves, thousands of missing children. The work isn't done, so I'll keep teaching, keep telling the story, keep speaking the names, until the last bell stops ringing, until every child comes home, until the schools that tried to kill cultures are themselves finally, truly, permanently closed. My name is James Winters. I taught at St. Catherine's Indian School in what should have been 2003, but was actually 1953. I witnessed horrors that the world is only now beginning to acknowledge. I watched children choose freedom through death rather than eternal imprisonment. And I survived to tell the story. This is my testimony. This is my witnessing. Remember their names, speak them aloud, never let them be forgotten again.